Under the bright American sun, a young woman accepts a job at the mansion of a man feared for his ruthlessness. What begins as a relationship marked by conflict and humiliation transforms into an unexpected bond where secrets, old wounds, and acts of redemption threaten to change both of their destinies forever. The morning air in Atlanta carried the familiar scent of brewing coffee when Sarah Johnson, 25, stepped through the wrought iron gates that separated her world from the universe of the Miller family. Her green eyes shone with determination as she adjusted her navy blue uniform, the same one she had bought with the last few dollars she had after paying the rent for the small apartment she shared with her younger sister Emily and their widowed mother, Grace. The mansion stood imposing against the blue sky, its brick walls contrasting with the perfectly manicured gardens where every leaf seemed to have been placed by divine design. Sarah had landed the job as a maid after weeks of desperate searching. Her mother needed medication for her diabetes, and Emily, barely 18, dreamed of studying nursing at the local community college. The $500 a week offered by the Miller family was their only hope. The new hire, she muttered to herself as she headed toward the service entrance. She had read about David Miller in the papers, 32 years old, heir to a construction empire that spanned half the state of Georgia, known for his explosive temper and ruthless business methods. Rumors said he had fired 5 maids in the last 6 months, but Sarah wasn't just any employee. She had grown up in a tough part of town, where every dollar was earned with sweat and every injustice was met with a fight. Her father, who had died in a construction accident 3 years prior, had taught her that dignity couldn't be bought or sold. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Thompson, a 60-year-old woman with tired but kind eyes, greeted her in the kitchen. "Honey, listen to me closely," she said, as she showed her the marble hallways she would have to clean. "Mr. Miller is complicated. Don't speak to him unless he asks you something. Don't touch his personal things, and above all, don't get involved in his family business." "Is he that terrible?" Sarah asked, noticing how Mrs. Thompson's voice trembled slightly. "Not terrible, just hurt. But a hurt man can be very dangerous." Sarah was dusting the furniture in the main study when she saw him for the first time. David Miller was exactly like his photographs in the papers, tall with an athletic build, his dark hair perfectly slicked back, and those cold blue eyes that seemed capable of freezing the soul. He wore a charcoal grey suit that probably cost more than Sarah's annual salary. But it wasn't his appearance that shocked her, but the scene she was witnessing. In the main garden, visible through the study windows, David had cornered Mr. Robertson, the 70-year-old gardener who had been tending the property for 2 decades. The old man, with his faded straw hat in his trembling hands, listened as the boss yelled at him for watering the roses an hour later than usual. "I pay you to do things when I tell you to do them," David's voice boomed, piercing the glass like a dagger. "Not whenever you feel like it. This is a business, not a charity for useless old men." Mr. Robertson tried to explain that he had to take his sick wife to the doctor, but David raised his hand to silence him. "I'm not interested in your excuses. Either you do your job right, or you find somewhere else to play gardener." Sarah felt her blood boil. She had grown up watching her own grandfather be humiliated by heartless bosses, and she had sworn she would never let something like that happen in front of her without doing anything. Without a second thought, she put the duster down on the desk and walked out into the garden. "Excuse me," she said in a firm voice, planting herself between David and Mr. Robertson. "I think you're being very unfair." David turned to her, his blue eyes first showing surprise, then fury. "I'm sorry. I said you're being unfair," Sarah repeated, crossing her arms over her chest. "Mr. Robertson has been taking care of this property for decades. One day he's late because of a family emergency doesn't make him a bad worker." The silence that followed was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Mr. Robertson stared at her with wide eyes, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The other employees who had witnessed the scene from a distance stood motionless. David approached her slowly, and Sarah could smell his expensive cologne, see the small lines of tension around his eyes. He was intimidating, no doubt, but she had faced worse things in her neighborhood. "Who are you?" he asked in a dangerously low voice. "I'm Sarah Johnson, the new maid." "And you're David Miller, my boss," she replied, without lowering her gaze. "But that doesn't mean you have the right to humiliate people." "Humiliate?" David let out a cold laugh. "I don't humiliate anyone. I demand efficiency, something you clearly don't understand. What I don't understand is how someone can be so cruel to a person who has dedicated his life to serving you." David's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Miss Johnson, let me explain something to you. This is my house, my company, and my rules. If you don't like them, there's the door. And let me explain something to you, Sarah retorted, taking a step forward. Money doesn't give you the right to trample on other people's dignity. Mr. Robertson is a human being, not your property. You're fired! David's shout echoed through the garden like thunder, but Sarah didn't flinch. Perfect, she said with a defiant smile. I'd rather starve than work for a heartless man. She turned around and started walking toward the house, but David's voice stopped her. I'm not done with you. Sarah turned around slowly, and for a moment their eyes met. In his blue eyes, she saw something more than anger. She saw defiance, curiosity, and something she couldn't identify. In her green eyes, David saw fire, determination, and a strength he hadn't encountered in a long time. Yes, you are, Sarah said calmly, because I quit. And with that, she headed toward the house, leaving David standing in the middle of the garden, with Mr. Robertson looking at him with a mix of gratitude for the young woman and terror for his boss. Mrs. Thompson was waiting for her in the kitchen, her face pale. Gurney, what have you done? What I had to, Sarah replied as she took off her apron. Some jobs just aren't worth it, Mrs. Thompson, and some men don't deserve respect if they don't know how to give it. But as she gathered her few belongings, Sarah couldn't help but wonder if she had made the biggest mistake of her life. Her family depended on this job, and she had just quit to defend a man she didn't even know well. What she didn't know was that David had stood motionless in the garden for 10 minutes after she left, repeating to himself the words that no employee had ever dared to say to him. Money doesn't give you the right to trample on other people's dignity. And for the first time in years, he felt challenged. Could the meeting of two such opposing forces really change the fate of both? If you liked this first part, leave us a like, comment from which city you are reading, and don't forget to subscribe to find out how this story of pride, dignity, and warring hearts continues. Chapter 2. 3 days later, Sarah was walking through the paved streets of downtown Atlanta, with the midday sun burning her back as she held her 10th resume of the day. The bells of a nearby church chimed noon, reminding her that time was running out. In her small cloth bag, she had barely $20 left, what was left of her savings after buying her mother's medication. There are no jobs, the woman at the diner had told her. With the economy, everyone is cutting staff. At the shopping mall, the answer was the same. At the office buildings, they didn't even let her speak. The pride she had felt when she confronted David Miller was slowly fading, replaced by the raw reality. She needed to work, and decent jobs were scarce in a city where the rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer. She arrived home as the sunset painted the sky orange and pink. The small 2-bedroom apartment in the suburbs smelled of pot roast and gravy. Her mother, Grace, a 50-year-old woman prematurely aged by worry, greeted her with a forced smile. How did it go, honey? Good, Mum, Sarah lied, tucking the rejections into her bag along with her broken hopes. Emily, her younger sister, was sitting at the small kitchen table, studying with books borrowed from the library. Seeing Sarah arrive, she closed her notebook with a guilty expression. Did you get a job yet? She asked with the innocence of someone who still believes that problems solve themselves. I'm working on it, Sarah replied, avoiding her eyes. That night, while her family slept, Sarah sat on the small balcony overlooking the street. The city lights flickered like fallen stars, and the distant sound of traffic mixed with the noise of televisions on in the neighboring apartments. She thought of her father and how he would have handled the situation. You defend your dignity, honey, he used to tell her, but you provide for your family. The next day, fate played its cards in an unexpected way. Sarah was at the local farmer's market, buying vegetables with the last few dollars she had, when she heard a familiar voice behind her. Miss Johnson. She turned around and found Mrs. Thompson, the miller's housekeeper. The older woman looked nervous, constantly looking over her shoulder as if she expected someone to follow her. Mrs. Thompson, Sarah greeted, surprised. What are you doing here? I came to find you, Mrs. Thompson said in a low voice. Mr. Miller needs to see you. Sarah felt her jaw tighten. He needs me? For what? To humiliate me again? No, honey. It's different. Something happened after you left. Mrs. Thompson told her what had happened. After the incident in the garden, David had been strangely quiet for days. He hadn't yelled at any employee, hadn't thrown tantrums over small mistakes, and had even asked about the health of Mr. Robertson's wife. But the strangest thing of all was that he had asked about her. He asked about me. Yes. He said he needed to talk to you, that it was important. Sarah shook her head. I'm not going back to that house just to have him yell at me again. Honey, Mrs. Thompson gently took her arm. I also know why you need the job. A neighbor of yours is my cousin. I know about your mum, your sister. Sarah's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but Mrs. Thompson continued. Mr. Miller is offering triple the original salary if you come back. Triple? Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. $1,500 a week. With that, she could pay for her mother's medication, Emily's college tuition, and maybe even rent a better place. Why would he do that? Mrs. Thompson shrugged. I don't know, honey, but he says it's an offer he'll only make once. During the ride back to the mansion, Sarah debated between pride and necessity. The image of her mother taking her pills with trembling hands, of Emily studying with torn books, of her father telling her that sometimes you have to swallow your pride to feed your family, repeated itself in her mind like a mantra. The mansion looked the same as always, imposing, perfect, cold. But when Mrs. Thompson led her to the main study, Sarah noticed something different in the atmosphere. David was sitting behind his mahogany desk, but he didn't have his usual haughty posture. He looked tired. When she entered, he looked up, and for a moment, their eyes met again. This time there was no anger in his blue gaze, but something that looked like curiosity mixed with respect. Miss Johnson, he said, standing up, thank you for coming. Mr. Miller, she replied, standing tall, I was told you needed to speak with me. David nodded and walked to the window overlooking the garden, where Mr. Robertson was working peacefully among the roses. What you said the other day about dignity, he began without turning to look at her. I can't get it out of my head. Sarah didn't respond, waiting to see where the conversation was going. I've been thinking, maybe I was too hard on Roberto, on everyone. Maybe? The word came out more sarcastically than Sarah had planned. David turned to her, and for the first time since she had known him, Sarah saw something resembling vulnerability in his eyes. Okay, I was cruel. Unnecessarily cruel. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither dared to fully cross. Why did you call me? Sarah finally asked. Because... David paused, as if the words were difficult to say. Because in 22 years of running this company, no one had ever dared to stand up to me the way you did. And because... maybe you were right. Sarah felt something stir in her chest, but she stood firm. And I'm offering you the job again. Triple the original salary. And I promise you that what happened the other day won't happen again. You promise me? The man who humiliated an old man for being late once in 20 years? David's jaw tightened, but he didn't lose his composure. Yes, I promise you. Sarah studied him for a long moment. She desperately needed the money, but something inside her told her that accepting would be dangerous. Not because of the job itself, but because of the way this man made her feel. Confused, defiant, alive in a way she hadn't experienced before. What would be my conditions? She finally asked. The same as before. Cleaning, helping in the kitchen when Mrs. Thompson needs it, tending to occasional guests. No, Sarah said, surprising them both with her firmness. My conditions. David raised an eyebrow. Are you in a position to negotiate now? I'm in a position to leave again if I don't like what I hear, she retorted, with a half-smile that didn't reach her eyes. Condition number 1. If you ever yell at or humiliate another employee in front of me, I quit immediately and there's no second chance. David stared at her. And the second? Mutual respect. I do my job well. You treat me with dignity. No shouted orders. No cruel sarcasm. And if you don't fulfill your responsibilities, then you fire me for valid reasons, not because of a tantrum. The tension in the air was palpable. David approached her slowly, and Sarah could feel his presence like a magnetic force. You're very bold for someone who needs this job, he murmured. And you're very proud for someone who's asking me to come back, she replied, without taking a step back. For a moment, Sarah thought he was going to explode again, but instead, David did something completely unexpected. He smiled. Not a kind smile, but a smile of recognition from someone who had found a worthy opponent. Okay, Miss Johnson, I accept your conditions. When they shook hands to seal the agreement, Sarah felt an electric shock run through her arm. By the way David's eyes widened slightly, he had felt it too, but neither of them said anything. Mrs. Thompson was waiting outside with a relieved smile. Is everything okay, you two? Everything's fine, Sarah confirmed, although she knew that nothing would be simple from this moment on. That night, as she returned home with the signed contract and the first advance payment in her bag, Sarah couldn't help but wonder if she had won a battle or gotten herself into a war much bigger than she could imagine. What she didn't know was that David had stayed in his study until very late, reliving the moment their hands touched, wondering why a maid from a poor neighborhood had the power to make him question everything he had believed in for years. Can two such strong personalities coexist under the same roof, or will the tension between them finally explode? The story is just beginning. Chapter 3. The first 2 weeks of Sarah's second chance at the Miller mansion passed like a delicate dance between two adversaries who respect each other but don't trust each other. David kept his word. He didn't yell at the employees in front of her, but Sarah could see the tension in his jaw whenever something wasn't perfect, as if he were containing a volcano about to erupt. A routine gradually established itself. Sarah arrived every morning at 6, when the Atlanta air still held the coolness of dawn, and the oak trees in the garden woke up with their sweet fragrance. Mrs. Thompson had assigned her the common areas on the ground floor, the main study, and the library. David seemed to have a calculated schedule to avoid running into her more than necessary, but when their paths did cross, the exchange was tense and charged with electricity. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," Sarah would say every time she saw him come down the marble staircase, impeccable in his designer suits. "Good morning, Miss Johnson," he would reply in that deep voice that seemed to resonate in her bones, and that was all. But in those brief exchanges, Sarah began to notice things. How David discreetly observed the way she treated the other employees, how his eyes lingered a fraction of a second longer than necessary on her face, how he seemed to look for reasons to pass through the rooms she was cleaning. The first real conflict came in the 3rd week. Sarah was organizing the library, an immense room with mahogany shelves that went from floor to ceiling, filled with books that smelled of leather and knowledge accumulated over generations. It was her favorite part of the job because she could get lost reading titles and dreaming of worlds she could never afford to visit. She was up on a ladder, dusting the highest volumes, when she heard angry voices in the adjacent study. She immediately recognized David's voice, but the other was unfamiliar, an older man with an authoritative accent. "This is unacceptable, David. Productivity has dropped 20% since you started with these considerations." "The numbers are still good, Uncle Frank," David replied in a controlled voice. "Good isn't good enough. Your father built this empire by being tough, demanding, not by giving old gardeners vacations and raises to whiny employees." Sarah stood motionless on the ladder. She knew she shouldn't listen, but she couldn't move without making noise. "My father also knew that loyal employees are worth more than terrified employees," David retorted. "Loyalty?" Frank let out a bitter laugh. "Loyalty is bought with authority, not with kindness. And if you can't understand that, maybe it's time for someone else to make the important decisions." The silence that followed was so tense that Sarah could feel it through the wall. When Frank spoke again, his voice was lower but more dangerous. "That new maid, Johnson, several of the partners are saying that there have been changes since she arrived." "What kind of changes?" "Changes in you. You've gotten soft. And that's dangerous for business." "Sarah has nothing to do with the company's decisions." The use of her first name made Sarah feel a strange tingle in her stomach. "Sarah now?" Frank laughed coldly. "See what I mean? You're losing perspective. That woman is a maid, David, not your equal. She is a respectable employee doing an honest job." "She's a distraction, and if you can't see that, then you really need help." The conversation continued for several more minutes, but Sarah could no longer focus on the words. Her mind was racing, processing what she had heard. David had defended her. He had used her name with a familiarity that didn't exist between them publicly, and apparently her presence was causing ripples in his business world. When she finally managed to get down from the ladder without making a sound, her hands were trembling slightly. She didn't know if it was from anger, fear, or something more complicated that she didn't want to name. That afternoon, as she was cleaning the study, David came in unexpectedly. Sarah was turned away, organizing papers in a filing cabinet, when she heard the door close. "Miss Johnson." She turned around and found him leaning against the door, with his arms crossed and an expression she couldn't decipher. "Do you need something, Mr. Miller? Did you hear the conversation this morning?" Sarah felt herself blush, but she decided to be honest. "By accident. I was in the library and the voices carried." David nodded slowly. "And what do you think about it?" The question took her by surprise. "It's not my place to have an opinion on your family or business matters. I'm asking you for your opinion." Sarah studied him carefully. There was something different in his posture, an openness she hadn't seen before. "I think your uncle is wrong," she finally said. "But I also think he's right about one thing. I'm a maid, and you're my boss. And if my presence here is causing you problems—" "No," David interrupted her, approaching her. "My uncle is used to me being a certain way. But that way, I didn't like who I was when I acted like that." "And do you like who you are now?" The question hung in the air between them. David had come so close that Sarah could see the small golden lines in his blue eyes. She could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I'm still figuring it out," he admitted, with an honesty that surprised her. "And what happens if your uncle decides that I'm a problem that needs to be solved?" David looked her directly in the eyes. Then he's going to be in for a very unpleasant surprise when he tries to do that. The intensity in his voice made Sarah feel a shiver that had nothing to do with fear. Why? She whispered without realizing it. Because, David paused, as if he realized he was about to cross a line he couldn't uncross. Because you're a good employee, and I don't tolerate anyone intimidating my staff. It was a safe, professional answer. But the way he said it, the way his eyes lingered on her lips before returning to her gaze, suggested there was much more he wasn't saying. I understand, Sarah said, although she wasn't sure what exactly she understood. You do, yes. But I also understand that if my job here is making your life complicated, I can find another place. No, David said quickly, too quickly. I don't want you to look for another place. They looked at each other in silence for a moment that seemed eternal. Then David took a step back, breaking the spell. How is your mother? He asked, abruptly changing the subject. The question surprised Sarah so much that it took her a moment to answer. Better, thank you. The medication is helping. And your sister, Emily, how do you know her name? David shrugged with feigned nonchalance. Mrs. Thompson mentions things, but Sarah knew that Mrs. Thompson was very discreet with personal information, which meant that David had asked specifically. She's doing well, excited to start her nursing classes. It's a good career, honorable, like cleaning houses, Sarah said with a defiant smile. David stared at her. Like cleaning houses, he agreed after a moment. When he left the study, Sarah stood in the same spot for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. There was an undercurrent in their interactions now, something that hadn't been there the first few weeks. It was as if they were having two conversations at the same time, the one they were actually having, and a deeper one that neither dared to verbalize. That evening, on her way home, Sarah stopped at the small church of St. Paul's, where she had been going to Mass since she was a child. She sat on one of the worn wooden pews and looked toward the altar, where the candles flickered like small stars in the gloom. I don't know what's happening, Dad, she murmured, talking to her father as she had since his death, but I'm afraid it's something I can't control. What she didn't know was that, at the same time, David was in his private study, looking out the window at the lit-up city, wondering when exactly he had started looking forward to the mornings, just because they meant seeing those green eyes again that challenged him and calmed him at the same time. And they were both right to be afraid, because what was growing between them was exactly the kind of thing you can't control, predict, or stop once it begins. The tension is growing, the lines are blurring, and two worlds that should never have met are beginning to collide in ways neither expected. Can fire and ice coexist, or will one end up melting the other? The story is about to take a turn that will change everything. Chapter 4. The catalyst arrived on a rainy Tuesday in October when the streets of Atlanta turned into mirrors, reflecting the gray sky, and the smell of wet earth crept in through all the windows. Sarah had noticed that David seemed more tense than usual that week, answering calls with a clenched jaw and locking himself in his study for hours. Mrs. Thompson had whispered to her that it was the anniversary of something important, but she hadn't given any more details. Sarah was finishing up cleaning the main living room when she heard the phone ring in the study. David's voice could be heard through the door, initially controlled, but gradually more agitated. No, doctor, there has to be something else you can do. How much time? I see, yes, I understand. I'll be there in an hour. The silence that followed was so profound that Sarah could hear the tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Then, without warning, she heard the sound of something being thrown against the wall, followed by a cry of frustration that chilled her blood. Without thinking, she ran to the study and burst through the door. David was standing in the middle of the room, his hands in his hair and his eyes closed. At his feet, the remains of a crystal vase lay scattered like frozen tears. His impeccable suit was wrinkled, his tie was loosened, and for the first time since she had known him, Sarah saw him completely disarmed. Mr. Miller, he opened his eyes and looked at her as if he had forgotten where he was. His blue eyes shone with a moisture he was desperately trying to hold back. Sarah, I didn't know you were there. I heard the noise. Are you okay? David laughed bitterly. Okay? No, I'm not okay. I haven't been okay in a long time. Sarah closed the door behind her and approached carefully, avoiding the glass fragments. What happened? For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer, that he would close himself off again behind his mask of control and kick her out of the study. But instead, David collapsed into his leather chair and covered his face with his hands. It's my younger sister, he said in a broken voice. She's in the hospital in Boston, terminal cancer. The doctor says she has weeks left. Sarah felt her heart clench. I'm so sorry. Isabel, David continued as if he needed to say her name out loud. She's 28. She was an artist. She painted the most beautiful things you've ever seen, and I haven't spoken to her in 3 years. Why? David looked up at her, and Sarah saw in his eyes a pain so deep that it left her breathless. Because when our father died, Isabel wanted to sell the company and donate part of the money to art foundations. I thought she was a naive kid who didn't understand the real world. I said things to her, terrible things, that she was a useless dreamer, that art wouldn't put food on the table, that if she wanted to throw away the family money, she could do it with her own, but not with mine. Oh my God. She left that same night. She moved to Boston, changed her last name to our mother's maiden name, and never spoke to me again. Not even when Mum got sick. Not even when Mum died. Sarah stood motionless, processing this revelation. Your mother is dead? 2 years ago, heart attack. Isabel came to the funeral, but she stayed on the other side of the cemetery. She saw me. I saw her, but neither of us approached the other. And now, his voice completely broke. Now it's too late to fix things. Without thinking, Sarah moved closer to him. No, it's not too late. It's never too late to ask for forgiveness. David looked at her with desperate eyes. How do you know that? How can you be so sure? Because when my father died, the last words we exchanged were during a silly fight about money. He wanted me to go to college instead of working. I yelled at him that we were too poor for those luxuries. The last thing I said to him was that I wished he would understand reality instead of living in dreams. Sarah felt tears burning her eyes. I spent months hating myself for that, until I realized that he knew I loved him, despite the cruel words. True love transcends mistakes. But what if Isabel doesn't forgive me? What if it's too late? Sarah moved closer, until she was standing right in front of him. Without thinking, she put her hands on his. Then at least you'll know you tried, that you didn't let pride win again. David looked at their intertwined hands, as if he couldn't believe it was real. Why are you so kind to me, after how I treated you at first, after everything you've seen? Because we all deserve second chances. And because... Sarah stopped, realizing she was about to say something that would change everything between them. Because what? Because I see who you really are when you're not trying to be the man you think you have to be. Their eyes met, and held the gaze for a moment that seemed eternal. In those blue eyes, Sarah saw gratitude, vulnerability, and something deeper that made her feel as if she were standing on the edge of a cliff. Come with me, David said suddenly. What? To Boston, to see Isabel. I don't think I can do it alone. Sarah blinked, confused. I can't do that. I'm your employee, not your... You're my friend, David said with a certainty that surprised them both. Aren't you? The word friend hung in the air between them, charged with meanings neither was ready to examine too closely. Yes, I guess so. Then come with me, as my friend. I'll pay you for the days you miss work, of course, and all expenses. I don't want to be alone when I see her. Sarah studied his face, seeing the vulnerability beneath the plea. This was not the arrogant millionaire she had met months ago. This was a scared man who had just lost all the people he loved because of his own stubbornness, and who was asking for help for the first time in his life. Okay, she said softly. I'll go with you. The relief that crossed David's face was so intense that Sarah felt a pang in her chest. Thank you, he murmured, squeezing her hands. Thank you, Sarah. It was the first time he had said her name directly to her, and the way it sounded on his lips sent waves of warmth through her body. 3 hours later, they were at the Atlanta airport waiting for their flight to Boston. David had called Mrs. Thompson to explain the situation, cancelled all his meetings for the week, and made reservations at a downtown hotel. Throughout the process, Sarah had watched him gradually transform from the broken man in the study to the efficient businessman she knew. But with one difference, he was no longer cold. He was simply focused. On the plane, sitting side by side in first class, David had insisted on upgrading Sarah's ticket. They talked about things they had never shared before. David told her about his childhood, about how he and Isabel had been inseparable until their father's death, about how the pressure of inheriting an empire at 24 had hardened him prematurely. Isabel always said I was afraid to be happy, he admitted, as he looked at the clouds outside the window. That I thought if I let my guard down, everything would fall apart. And was she right? David looked at her. Probably. But now I think maybe losing everything out of fear is worse than losing it by trying. When they arrived at the hospital, David stopped in the parking lot, his hands clutching the steering wheel of the rented car. What if she hates me? He asked, like a scared child. What if she doesn't? Sarah replied softly. David took a deep breath and nodded. Will you come with me? Of course. Isabel Miller Garcia was in a private room on the 7th floor, with windows overlooking the hospital gardens. When they entered, Sarah had to stifle a gasp. The woman in the bed was incredibly similar to David. The same blue eyes, the same strong bone structure, but where he radiated power, she radiated an ethereal fragility that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Isabel looked up when they entered, and Sarah saw the exact moment she recognized her brother. Her eyes filled with tears, but her expression remained cautious. "David," she said softly. "Isabel." David approached the bed slowly, as if he feared she would disappear. Can I sit down?" She nodded, and he took the chair next to the bed. Sarah stayed near the door, feeling that she should give them privacy, but not wanting to leave David alone. "How did you know I was here?" Isabel asked. "I hired a private investigator months ago to find out where you were, just to make sure you were okay. But I never had the courage to approach you. And now you do?" David looked towards Sarah, who gave him an encouraging smile. "Now I realize that pride isn't worth it if it keeps me from being here when you need me." Isabel followed his gaze to Sarah. "Who is she?" "She's—" David stopped, searching for the right words. "She's the person who helped me remember who I used to be before I became what Dad wanted me to be." The silence that followed was tense, but not hostile. "Do you remember," Isabel finally said, "when we were kids, and you used to say that when you grew up, you were going to build a hospital just for sick children?" David blinked, surprised. "I had forgotten that." "I never forgot it. I thought that when you inherited the company, you would make it a reality." "Isa, I'm so sorry for what I said to you. I'm sorry I hurt you. I'm sorry I was so blind and so cruel." Tears finally streamed down Isabel's cheeks. "I'm sorry too, David. I'm sorry I abandoned you when Mom died. I'm sorry I wasn't there." When the siblings hugged, Sarah had to turn to the window to give them privacy and to hide her own tears. But what really moved her was not just the reconciliation, but the transformation she had witnessed in David. The man who had yelled at a gardener for being late was now crying openly as he asked his sister for forgiveness, and she realized, with a clarity that scared her, that she was falling in love with him. Are you enjoying this story of transformation and second chances? Comment from which city you are reading, and what was the moment that most moved you. Do you believe in the transformative power of love? Have you seen second chances change destinies in real life? Subscribe for more stories that celebrate dignity, courage, and the triumph of the heart over circumstances, because we all deserve to believe that true love exists and that it can change everything. Chapter 5. The days in Boston became a continuous revelation for Sarah. David had booked separate rooms at the hotel, but they spent most of their time together, either at the hospital visiting Isabel or exploring the city while she rested. Without the rigid structure of the mansion and the roles of boss and employee, their relationship began to evolve into something neither of them knew how to name. Isabel improved considerably during that week, not physically, but emotionally. Having her brother back in her life seemed to have given her a new reason to fight. The doctors talked about experimental treatments, of hope where before there had only been resignation, and at the center of it all was David, transformed into someone Sarah barely recognized. "Did you know your brother bought 3 of my paintings yesterday?" Isabel said to Sarah one afternoon, while David was out making work calls. "He's planning on donating them to the Contemporary Art Museum in Atlanta." "I didn't know he had bought your paintings," Sarah replied, although it didn't surprise her. In the last few days she had seen David make dozens of small and big gestures, paying for Isabel's medical expenses without her knowing, contacting the best oncologist in the country, even calling some of her artist friends to organize a small exhibition of her work. "He's also funding an art scholarship at the college I wanted to go to years ago," Isabel continued with a weak smile. "He says he's going to call it the Isabel Miller Scholarship for Brave Dreamers." Sarah felt her heart swell. "That's a beautiful name." "He's very changed," Isabel observed, carefully studying Sarah's face. "And I think you have a lot to do with that." "I just helped him remember who he really was." "No, Sarah, you did much more than that. I saw him yesterday when he thought no one was watching. He looked at you as if you were the most valuable thing in the room. As if you were his anchor." Sarah felt herself blush. "Isabel, I'm just his employee. We come from very different worlds." "So what? My brother has had enough money his whole life. What he's never had is someone who sees him as a man instead of a bank account. Someone who challenges him to be better." That night, as they were returning to the hotel after dinner, David was unusually silent. They had spent the day at the Museum of Fine Arts, and Sarah had seen a completely new facet of him, sensitive, reflective, capable of getting lost in a work of art for hours. Now they were walking through the illuminated streets of the historic district, with the distant sound of jazz music mixing with the murmur of the nighttime city. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked when the silence became too heavy. "That I don't want to go back to Atlanta. David admitted, stopping in front of a lit-up fountain. "Here I can be in myself, without expectations, without pressure, without having to be the David everyone expects. But you have responsibilities. The company, the employees." "I know." He turned to her, and in the light of the streetlights, his blue eyes seemed deeper than ever. "But these days with you have been the most real I've lived in years." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "David, do you know what scares me the most?" he continued, moving closer. "That when we go back, we'll go back to being boss and employee. That all this has just been a parenthesis in our real lives. And what do you want us to be?" The question escaped Sarah's lips before she could stop it. David stared at her, and for a moment the whole world seemed to shrink to the space between them. "I want us to be us, without titles, without class differences, without anything more than this." He pointed to the space between their hearts. "This what? This thing I feel when I look at you. This thing that makes me want to be a better man. This thing that keeps me awake at night, thinking about your smile." Sarah felt her breath catch. "David, we can't." "Why not?" "Because you're you and I'm me. Because when we go back to reality, none of this is going to make sense. None of this." David moved closer, until she could feel his breath on her face. "This doesn't make sense." Before Sarah could answer, he put his hands on her face and kissed her. The world stopped. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if David was waiting for her to reject him. But when Sarah didn't pull away, when her own hands found their way to his chest, the kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more desperate. When they finally separated, both were breathless. "This is crazy," Sarah murmured against his lips. "The best kind of crazy," David replied, kissing her forehead gently. But reality caught up with them the next day. They were having breakfast at the hotel when David's phone rang insistently. It was Mrs. Thompson, and her voice sounded agitated even through the speaker. "Mr. Miller, you need to come back immediately. Your Uncle Frank has called an emergency board meeting. He says you are emotionally compromised and can't make objective decisions for the company." David went pale. "When is the meeting?" "Tomorrow at 10. And David, they're talking about removing you as CEO." The trip back to Atlanta was tense. David spent the 2-hour flight on the phone with lawyers and advisors, his face gradually hardening back into the mask of control that Sarah knew so well. By the time they landed, the man who had kissed her under the lights of Boston seemed like a distant memory. "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked, as they waited for their luggage. "I'm going to fight for what's mine," David replied in a cold voice. "The company is my life. I'm not going to let my uncle take it from me." "And us?" David paused but didn't look at her. "Sarah, these days were special, but now I have to focus on saving my company." Sarah felt as if she had been slapped. "I understand." "No, you don't understand." He finally looked at her, and in his eyes she saw an internal struggle that broke her in two. "You understand too well. That's why it's so dangerous." In the car to the mansion they rode in silence. Sarah looked out the window at the familiar Atlanta landscapes, wondering how she could have been so naive to think that a kiss could change the reality of their circumstances. When they arrived at the mansion, David got out of the car without looking at her. "Mrs. Thompson will bring you up to speed on everything you've missed," he said formally. "I expect you to resume your normal responsibilities tomorrow." "Of course, Mr. Miller." The use of the formal title was like a wall rising between them. David visibly winced at hearing it, but he didn't say anything else. That night, Sarah lay awake in her small employee room, staring at the ceiling and reliving every moment of the last few days. The kiss, the conversations, the way David had cried in his sister's arms. It had all been real. But it was also true that they belonged to different worlds, and that sometimes love wasn't enough to build bridges over such large chasms. The next morning, she arrived early to find the mansion in complete chaos. Mrs. Thompson was running back and forth, preparing everything for a meeting that would be held at the house, and Mr. Robertson was obsessively tidying the gardens as if the perfection of the roses could influence his boss's destiny. "How is he?" Sarah asked. "He hasn't slept," Mrs. Thompson replied with concern. "He's been in his study all night preparing for the meeting. And Sarah, some people have arrived from Boston, important shareholders. One of them asked about you specifically." "About me?" "Yes. Uncle Frank. He asked who you were, how long you had been working here, if you had traveled with Mr. Miller." Mrs. Thompson looked at her with worried eyes. "Honey, what happened in Boston?" Before Sarah could answer, they heard male voices approaching. Frank Miller entered the kitchen accompanied by 2 men in expensive suits, his eyes scanning the place with calculated disdain. "Ah, Miss Johnson," Frank said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just the person I wanted to see." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. The fight for David's heart and future was about to begin, and she, whether she liked it or not, had become a key piece in the game. The tension is at its peak. Can David defend both his company and his feelings, or will he have to choose between power and love? The fate of both will be decided in the final confrontation. Chapter 6. The boardroom of the Miller mansion had never hosted such a crucial battle. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the main shareholders of Miller Construction had gathered around the mahogany table that had belonged to David's grandfather. At the head, Frank Miller presided with the confidence of someone who already believed he was victorious. To his right sat the other 5 majority shareholders, old-school men who had built fortunes under the tough rules of no-compromise business. David occupied the opposite end of the table, dressed in his best navy blue suit, his face a perfect mask of professional control. But Sarah, who was watching discreetly from the hallway as she served coffee, could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed silently on the table. "Dear colleagues," Frank began in a slow, authoritative voice, "we have gathered today because the leadership of our company is in crisis. In recent months we have seen emotional decisions that have compromised our profitability and our market leadership." One of the shareholders, an older man named Patrick Collins, nodded gravely. "Complaints from supervisors have increased. They say David no longer has the authority needed to manage large teams." "Exactly," Frank continued. "And now, to top it all off, we have reports that our CEO is romantically involved with the domestic staff, a scandal that could ruin our corporate reputation." David stiffened, but kept his voice calm. "My personal life is not a topic for this meeting." "No?" Frank smiled coldly. "When that personal life includes company-paid trips with service employees, when it includes irrational decisions that have cost us important contracts." "I have not lost any important contracts," David retorted. "The Highlands project," another shareholder intervened. "We lost the bid because you refused to use the cheaper materials that the committee had proposed." "I refused because those materials did not meet the safety standards that my father established for this company." "Your father would have used any legal material to win that contract," Frank shouted, losing his composure for the first time. He understood that business requires toughness, not sentimentality. David stood up slowly, and Sarah could see the exact moment he made a decision. "You're right," he said in a clear voice that resonated through the room. "I have changed. I am no longer the man I was 6 months ago." Frank smiled triumphantly. "See, he admits he is no longer fit to—" "I admit that I am no longer willing to run this company as if it were a war machine," David interrupted. "I admit that I have remembered that behind every number in our reports, there are real families, real people, who deserve respect and dignity." He walked to the window overlooking the garden, where Mr. Robertson was working carefully among the roses. "That man," he pointed out, "has dedicated 20 years of his life to making this property beautiful. When he was late for a family emergency, my first reaction was to yell at him and humiliate him. Do you know who helped me see how wrong I was?" All eyes turned to where Sarah was standing, and she felt the world stop. "A 25-year-old maid who had the courage to stand up to me when no one else dared," David continued, looking directly at her. "A woman who taught me that true leadership does not come from fear but from respect." "This is exactly what we mean," Frank exploded. "You're taking business leadership advice from a maid. I'm taking humanity advice from an extraordinary woman," David corrected in a firm voice. "And if that makes you uncomfortable, then maybe this isn't the right company for me." The silence that followed was deafening. Patrick Collins cleared his throat nervously. "David, you're talking as if you're willing to resign." "I'm saying that I will not run this company under threats and blackmail," David replied. "I'm saying that if you believe success is measured only in cold numbers, then we have lost the soul of what my grandfather built." Frank stood up, his face red with anger. "Your grandfather built this by being tough, without sentimentality, without letting himself be influenced by—" "Without letting himself be influenced by what, Uncle Frank?" David turned to him with fiery eyes. "By love? By compassion? By recognizing that people are not disposable tools? By maids who don't know their place?" The phrase hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. David walked slowly toward his uncle, and when he spoke, his voice was dangerously low. "Be careful how you talk about Sarah. You're defending her now?" Frank smiled maliciously. "In a business meeting, in front of the shareholders. I will always defend her anywhere, in front of anyone." Sarah felt her breath catch. In all her wildest dreams, she had never imagined that someone would defend her like this, that someone would be willing to risk everything for her dignity. "Then," Frank said with venomous satisfaction, "you are confirming that your relationship with this woman has compromised your business judgment. I am confirming that my relationship with Sarah has helped me recover my humanity." David replied without blinking. "And if that means losing this company, then so be it." The chaos that followed was immediate. The shareholders began to talk all at once. Frank shouted about irresponsibility and scandal, and Patrick Collins banged on the table for order. In the midst of the turmoil, David approached Sarah. "Can you come with me?" he asked in a low voice. "David, I can't. This is a business meeting. This is my life," he corrected her, "and you are part of it." Sarah looked at the scandalized faces of the men around the table, then looked into David's blue eyes, filled with determination and something deeper. "Okay," she murmured. David took her hand and guided her to the table. The silence became absolute. "Gentlemen," David said in a clear, strong voice, "I want to officially introduce you to Sarah Johnson. Not only is she the best employee we have ever had, but she is the bravest, most honest and smartest woman I have ever met in my life, and I'm in love with her." Sarah felt her legs go weak. David had just declared his love in front of the most powerful men in Georgia. "And more importantly than that," David continued, squeezing her hand, "she has taught me what kind of man I want to be, what kind of leader I want to be. If you can't respect that, then you can have the company, but you won't have me." Frank was livid. "This is a scandal. It's completely unacceptable. Your father would be rolling in his grave." "My father," David said with a sad smile, "lost his family by chasing only money. He lost his relationship with my mother, with Isabel, with myself. I will not make the same mistake." Patrick Collins stood up slowly. "David, we understand that. Emotions can cloud judgment. Maybe if we take a recess." "There's nothing to recess," David interrupted. "Either you accept that I will run this company with my values, respecting all employees and making decisions based on both profitability and social responsibility, or you accept my immediate resignation." The ultimatum echoed through the room like thunder. It was then that Sarah did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She let go of David's hand and walked directly to Frank. "Mr. Miller," she said in a calm but firm voice, "you say that your nephew can no longer lead because he has become soft, but I have seen him make more difficult decisions in the last few months than many leaders make in years." "I beg your pardon?" Frank looked at her as if an ant had started talking to him. "I have seen David recognize his mistakes and ask for forgiveness when he was wrong. I have seen David sacrifice easy contracts to maintain quality standards that protect the families who are going to live in those buildings. I have seen David rebuild a relationship with his sister that he had lost out of pride." Sarah looked at each of the men at the table. "Do you think that's weakness? I think that's the kind of strength that builds lasting legacies." The silence that followed was different, less hostile, more reflective. Patrick Collins cleared his throat. "Miss Johnson." "Yes, sir." "Do you believe David can continue to be effective as CEO?" Sarah looked at David, saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the way he had risked everything to defend her, to defend what he believed was right. "I believe David can be the leader this company needs for the future, not just to make money, but to build something that your children and grandchildren can be proud of." Another long silence. Finally, Patrick Collins spoke. "Frank, maybe we should reconsider our position." "What?" Frank looked about to explode. "The numbers don't lie," another shareholder intervened. "Despite all these changes, profitability has remained stable and employee satisfaction has increased considerably. Staff turnover has dropped 60%, a third added. That's money saved on training and recruitment." David and Sarah looked at each other, not daring to breathe. "Besides," Patrick continued, "there's something to be said for a leader who inspires this kind of loyalty in his staff. Miss Johnson, you were willing to risk your job to defend David. That says something about the kind of respect he generates." Frank looked around the table, seeing support slip from his hands. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "Completely ridiculous." "You know what's ridiculous?" David said suddenly. "That we've gotten to the point where loving someone is considered a business weakness, that we've normalized cruelty so much that compassion seems revolutionary." He turned to Sarah, took her hands again. "Sarah, these months with you have taught me that success without a soul is not success at all, that leading without a heart is not leading, it's just bullying, and that love doesn't make you weak, it makes you brave." Before the eyes of everyone present, David knelt down. "Sarah Johnson, will you marry me?" The collective gasp echoed through the room. Sarah felt the world spin around her. "David, I know it's crazy. I know we're from different worlds, but I also know that with you, I'm the man I want to be, and I want to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you." Tears streamed freely down Sarah's cheeks. "Are you sure? Even if it means losing all this?" David looked around the room at the men who had been his partners for years, at the company that had been his life. "The only thing I can't afford to lose is you. "Yes," Sarah whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." When David stood up and kissed her, the silence in the room broke into a mix of murmurs, some of disapproval, others of surprise, and some, surprisingly, of admiration. Patrick Collins stood up and began to applaud slowly. One by one the other shareholders followed, until only Frank remained seated with his arms crossed. "Well," Patrick said with a smile, "I guess we have a wedding to plan, and a company to continue running with the same values we just witnessed." 3 months later, St. Paul's Church in the neighborhood where Sarah grew up was packed to the brim. Wealthy businessmen sat next to humble neighbors, mansion employees next to company shareholders. Isabel, who had responded better than expected to her treatment, had traveled from Boston to be the maid of honor. When Sarah walked down the aisle on the arm of Mr. Robertson, who had accepted the honor when she explained that he was the person at the mansion she respected the most, David felt his breath catch. Dressed in a simple white dress that had belonged to her grandmother, with flowers from the mansion's garden in her hair, Sarah was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. "Are you ready for this?" Patrick, who had agreed to be his best man after an unexpected friendship grew between them, whispered to him. "I've been ready since the day she first yelled at me," David replied with a smile. The vows they exchanged were simple, but profound. David promised to continue being the man Sarah had helped him discover. Sarah promised to continue challenging him to be his best version, and both promised to build a life based on respect, dignity, and true love. When the minister declared them husband and wife, the applause that echoed through the church seemed to celebrate more than just a wedding. It celebrated the proof that true love can transform hearts, change destinies, and build bridges where there were once only chasms. At the reception held in the gardens of the mansion that was now their home, David raised his glass for a toast. "To my wife," he said, looking at Sarah with eyes that shone with happiness, "who taught me that true wealth is not counted in dollars, but in the people you love and who love you back." And when the guests toasted, from Mrs. Thompson and Mr. Robertson to Isabel and the shareholders who had learned to respect the new direction of the company, Sarah knew she had found something more valuable than any fortune. She had found a love that had transformed not only 2 lives, but the entire world around them. 2 years later, as she held her son David Jr. in her arms and watched her husband plant roses in the garden next to Mr. Robertson, who was now the landscaping director for the entire company, Sarah reflected on the day she had first entered the Miller mansion. She could never have imagined that a confrontation in the garden would lead her to this, a family, a true love, and the certainty that sometimes the most beautiful endings are born from the most improbable beginnings. And in Atlanta, where the sun still paints the sunsets gold and pink, where the oak trees still perfume the streets with their sweetness, the story of Sarah and David is still told as proof that pride can bend to love, that dignity is never extra, and that truly brave hearts always find a way to love against all odds. You have witnessed a story where true love overcame pride and transformed lives. If this story touched your heart, let us know with a like. Comment from which city you are reading and what was the moment that most moved you. Do you believe in the transformative power of love? Have you seen second chances change destinies in real life? Subscribe for more stories that celebrate dignity, courage, and the triumph of the heart over circumstances, because we all deserve to believe that true love exists and that it can change everything.